Hello, and thank you for joining me and my special guest, Johan-Eklof, today. My name is Marnie-ogg, and this is Dark Sky Conversations, and here I hope you find a little bit of inspiration to create your own dark sky places or activities, or even just introducing them to your own home and environment. So if you haven't heard Johan-Eklof's name before, you may do so. He's got the most beautiful, poignant work, a book called the-dark-sky-manifesto, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend you do, and then pass it on to everyone else you know, because it's a poetic piece of work with a great sound degree of research into everything dark sky. Johan himself is now a bat researcher and author, and his desire to change our opinion on the night environment was something that drove this book. He realised that the negative words and association with evil or insecurity was something that needs to be changed if we're going to start embracing the night environment. So I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I do. I have to admit, I was a little bit nervous. My first real unknown guest. I hadn't met him before, and such a fabulous man too. So thank you, Johan, for giving up your time, and enjoy our conversation.
Hi, with a flick of a switch, we turn night to day and day to night. We can change seasons, actions and states of mind. Light is everywhere, used endlessly and very much a part of our modern world. But what is it? How do we use it? And how is it changing our environment and our behaviours? A star-filled sky used to be our evening's entertainment. Now it's Netflix, iPads, or even a podcast. When was the last time you looked at the night sky? I'm Marnie-ogg, and this is Dark Sky Conversations, the podcast that brings people and science together to shed light.
Hello, podcasters. Thank you very much for joining me and my very, very special guest, Johan-Eklof, from Sweden this evening, this morning, or wherever you are in the world, as we talk about his absolutely wonderful book, The Darkness Manifesto. And Johan, I've always thought that people could introduce themselves better than anything I could do. How did you become a doctor of zoology, and where did this book come from? So just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, yeah, the doctor thing, it was actually not my choice of subject from the beginning. I had this professor. I took a few classes with him, and we did my master's on trilobites, actually. Well, he was a zoologist, and he had this position for a PhD student, and I thought, well, perhaps it's easier just to apply for that and try to get a job as a biologist. It was very hard at the time. It's easier now, actually. But I like to work with him, so I applied for that and I got it. And he was a bat scientist, so I had to start to work with bats. But it turned out to be very, very fun. So I got hooked, and now I've been working with bats for 25 years.
And let's just go back a step. So you're in Sweden, and West Sweden. Are you able to tell us any sort of landmarks about where you are?
I'm 100 kilometers east of Gothenburg, so the second town of Sweden.
Yeah, so close to the Norwegian border there.
Yeah.
And not too far up the country. The country
No, it's
there.
southwest parts.
And is it dark? Is it relatively dark to the rest of Sweden?
Well, it's brighter than the north. But now it's getting lighter every day. So we're heading towards summer. Even though we have still plenty of snow, actually. The spring is really, really late for some reason.
So the seasons are completely strange, really. It's an interesting question, actually, because I've been very lucky to spend quite a lot of time in the Arctic and Sweden and Norway and Finland. And there's always this question around research, or, do we have enough understanding of the seasonal changes, up there where you can have 24 hours of sunlight and 24 hours of darkness, and you compare that to the equator. Are people happier in is it true? Are Swedish people really more happy than those in the equator?
I don't know. The last there was every time there is this what you call it when you measure happiness for different people in the world, and Finland has been winning this for quite a few years now. I'm not sure why, but they're not known to be happy, but obviously they are. I have no idea if it has something to do with the seasons or anything else, but as you say, it's very different from being up here and even, down south compared to the equator.
I remember the first time I truly experienced it, and we arrived in Norway, and it was the first day that the sun had broken over the horizon. And our lodge, so I'm a tour director, and I'm very lucky to take people to go and stargaze or look at the aurora or other, astronomical events around the globe. And our lodge manager was telling us what we would be having for dinner, and she saw the sun come across the horizon. It was lunchtime at the time, and she just stopped mid-sentence, and her eyes just sort of opened up brightly, and she stopped and she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. It's the first time I've seen the sun for 6 weeks." And, we as Australians just have no idea of that. Even in the middle of winter, we're stacked with
there is something happening in springtime when the sun is actually being warm for the first time. And even though we don't have it as dark here as in North Sweden, everybody just turns their head towards the sun, just stands still for a few seconds, and whatever they're doing, if they're waiting for the bus or whatever, they just turn their heads towards the sun, trying to gather as much D vitamin as they can. I don't know what it is, but
they're like sunflowers, aren't they? They just soak it up. It's quite interesting to watch.
So this time of the year is it's a great time because you can feel the warmth for the first time in quite a time.
So how do you imagine, how does that impact bats? Is there a difference in seasonal, is there a seasonal adjustment disorder for bats? Or?
Yeah, I was actually looking for bats under the midnight sun a few years ago up in Norway. And there is only one species that far north, and they have a very short season. Because it's so cold during the rest of the year. So they have a couple of months to do everything to get to raise their pups and to feed enough before winter. But at the same time, this short season has a lot of insects. I mean, being in Norway and here, I guess you notice how many mosquitoes there can be sometimes. And also it's very bright, so the bats are flying close to vegetation or very high up in the sky, or they try to avoid the predators as much as they can.
And who are the predators up there?
It's
birds?
It's predatory birds. So that's why the bats are actually flying in the middle of the night, because no one can catch them when it's dark. So darkness is their safety. So very few bats have actually adjusted to that. And these
bats have.
But they fly just for an hour or two around midnight when it's at the darkest. Although it's not very dark, it's still.
I have read bits of your book, and I have to say that I'm just so inspired by your writing. It's just beautiful. It's so well researched and so poetic at the same time. It really engages people. And in fact, one of the reviews that I read was just actually from a friend who was a radio announcer with Melbourne ABC, our national broadcaster. And he said, my wife's read it and she read it in 3 days, and I'm reading it now too. It's just so engaging. And I remember one of the comments that you made in it was that, we will never know how a bat sees the earth. And maybe you want to expand on that and tell us a little bit more. But I also found it very interesting that we will never know what another human's experiencing on this earth. So how could we ever gauge what an animal...
I mean, it's one of the old philosophical questions. How can we experience something from another person's point of view? I took this course in sensory ecology when I was a PhD student, and was one of the best courses I ever took. And you have to dive into all the... I mean, there's an array of senses in the animal world, which we can never understand. We can see this narrow wavelength span, and we can hear very few... I mean, there's so many animals experience other sounds, other parts of the spectrum. You can feel electricity. The pressure senses, the magnetic senses. There are so many things. There's so many clues in the world that we don't get.
Wow.
So we can just guess how they work. I mean, we can read about them, and we can, this cell does that, and that mechanism is doing that. But what is happening in the head, it's impossible to know, and that's very fascinating.
And particularly with light. You mentioned in the book that I think it's bats that see the ground that would sparkle.
Yeah, I mean, we see the visible part of the light. Well, it's visible because we think it's visible. But there's so many. I mean, insects, for example, see the UV spectrum, and we have the infrared spectrum for other animals. And I really like the marine animals having. I mean, they can see colors like we have no idea that they even existed.
Which is pretty amazing, isn't it? When we think, we go diving underwater and we go 5 meters under and we lose 50% of any color in coral or anything that's underwater, and yet they're seeing these amazing array of.
Yeah, we still think it's very beautiful, but I mean, imagine how looking at it with crayfish eyes or whatever.
Yeah. And I guess the question is could we ever put ourselves in that position that we would start adapting our human environment to actually benefit natural environments? Do you think that's possible?
Well, I don't know. I mean, there's technology for everything now, so at the same time, I'm not sure we want to experience everything because we have just get an information overload. There's a reason why our senses are limited. We can't process it.
But what if we were not doing it for our benefit, but for the animals' benefit? And I know this is a huge question because I know just even from the Dark Sky conferences I've been to that there are a variety of bats that do very well with red light, but there are some that don't, and there are some that do better. And so we would have to create this dark sky sensitive lighting for every single animal that lived in a very small region, perhaps.
I mean, if we could enhance our night vision, for example, then we wouldn't need any streetlights anymore. That would be very beneficial.
That's a nice solution. Yeah.
So just night goggle lenses, sort of.
That's an amazingly simple suggestion. I've done maybe 40 podcasts, and everybody's talked about the technology of dimmers and motion sensors and everything else, but yet if we could just improve our own night vision, yes.
There's so many people just telling me, well, it's so dark, I need to see when I'm walking my dog at night, and bring a head torch. I mean,
yes, sometimes the simplest answer is the best, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you see light pollution growing in Scandinavia? Do you see much contribution, or is there an awareness for dark sky sensitivity?
It's growing awareness. When I started to write the book, and I had bat talks, there was no one ever heard of light pollution.
Which was when? When were you doing this?
Let's say 5 years ago.
Oh, really? As soon as early as that ago? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but when I have talks today about the book or about bats, most people have actually heard the term somewhere. So it's happened a lot, and a lot of municipalities say they bring darkness into their lighting plans and visions for the future, even though it's on a very small scale, but it's a growing awareness still. But we don't have any dark sky communities or anything like that here yet.
Oh, well, maybe we can help change that. We could help grow that. And what sort of steps are these communities taking? Is it just a matter of putting it into their lighting management plan, or looking at what lights they're purchasing and how they're using that? Or
well, it's a lot about using, for example, red lights or motion detectors and timers to a larger extent than previously. We've always had a lot of energy here. We've have a lot of so we've never been forced to save the energy. So when the LEDs arrived in the 90s and we started to change all the light bulbs, we could easily buy 2 lamps instead of 1 or 3 or 4, and because they were so cheap, so we didn't need to think about the energy costs. So that's why the light pollution is growing so rapidly. I was looking at street maps for Gothenburg. I had this project, and I was looking at one of the major parks, and the satellite images it was very striking how small the area of darkness has become over a 10-year period. It was when looking at the satellite photos, it was so obvious.
And I understand too that it's not such an issue in summer, obviously, because you've got such long days. But in winter, you have the reflection of the snow as well. So it's really magnifying that impact of light pollution. Although I have a question, how much ecology is being impacted at that time of year? Is there much wildlife in the environment in winter?
Well, we have, like the roe deers, mooses, and birds that are staying here instead of migrating somewhere else. But all the insects are asleep somewhere, and bats are hibernating. So the wildlife is kind of sparse at the time. So if we use some Christmas lights here, I think we will survive that. But still, we still don't know very much. When I started to research the books, I was able to read most of the papers on the subject. But by the end of the book, it was so much coming out already. So
and this is over a 5-year period that you wrote the book?
I started thinking about it 5 years ago. I wrote it it came out 2020 in Sweden, and I started perhaps 2018 or something like that to write it. But over that time, there's so many papers and so many articles and books published on the subject. And for every animal or every plant being studied, the researchers find some that they are affected somehow. So there's new research coming out all the time. So I think even though we say that, it's so dead in the winter anyway, we can just shine, can put lights everywhere, but if nothing else, we are affected.
That's right. Yeah. And is it? I don't know how to say. Is it hygge? The philosophy of sort of coming back and being cozy time was what I heard the Norwegians call it. Yeah. And just the impact of the cultural change of that. If you've got lights up everywhere and you don't need to sort of come back inside to yourself and your activities and the family or whatever that culturally has been bound together in that period, then that's a change in itself.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we have like a 24/7 society, and it's global, and we expect it to be, the lights to be on everywhere. I mean, we would like to borrow a book from the library at 2:00 in the night if we feel like
it. If it suits you, yeah.
Go to the gym in the middle of the night, and we just expect things to be like that.
Not to mention hospitals that need lighting, but I think one of the biggest issues is that certainly in Australia is the amount of light that we're using for entertainment or advertising. Billboards are going up everywhere with LEDs in them, and light festivals that used to be 2 weeks are now 10 weeks, and so.
You're listening to Dark Sky Conversations with marnie-ogg. We'll be right back after these messages from our sponsors.
So what was your impetus? What made you think, okay, I've got to write a book about this? Was there something that just, a burning flame that came to you?
Sort of. I was doing a bat survey in southern Sweden. We were going around different castles to look for bats in the gardens of the castles. It was quite a nice job.
It would sound it.
But we realized that the castles were pretty dark. They were not, there was no floodlights or anything on most of them, compared to the churches in the area. They all had the floodlights on. So then we thought, well, we need to find out how this is affecting the bats. So we started to do these church surveys on long-eared bats. And that's when I thought that, well, I don't like this. I've been working with bats for 20 years at the time. Been out in the dark for quite a while, and it felt like we're losing something if we do this all the time. So maybe I should write a positive book about darkness. Because language-wise, darkness is all bad.
It is.
And well, I turned out writing about the negative impact on light, and not as much as the positive aspects of darkness. But I think I got that as well. So, but that was the main idea, to turn it around a little bit and bring the positive out of the darkness.
I think you probably have succeeded in that, because I think that's the difference in the book, actually. That, there's a couple of books out there that talk about the benefits of darkness and what we're losing, and what if your children never see the stars, and all these sorts of things. But I think, as I said at the beginning, there's this element of storytelling, but with this view of hope. I mean, even right at the very beginning, where you talk about the mimosa plant, and then Rosbosch, Hall and Young discovering the gene for circadian rhythms, and I guess there's this impetus or this flow in the book for me that actually makes me think, okay, so what's going to happen next? How can we get through this? What are we going to learn next? I guess, and rather than being negative. So yes, well done. I think that's what's made the book so popular.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how it's spreading. I mean, I was happy when it was translated into English. It was, but now it's, I think, 10 languages or something like that. It's just weird.
Wow. And it was probably never what you thought you would be. You'd never be doing interviews with someone in Australia about the book that you wrote.
No, I was just writing a book about darkness. I thought, well, it's a fun idea. And this needs to be said. I mean, I wanted to put the light pollution on the agenda in Sweden to start with, but I mean...
And in all the little anecdotes and stories that you tell, is there one that's particularly favoured by you? Do you have, when you started to research, did you think, wow, this is amazing? Yeah.
Well, it's hard to tell, but I was a little bit surprised about how much the marine life is affected. That was nothing that I thought about before. So there are so many, I mean, on the coral reefs, for example, or even in the deep sea when the plankton and everything is migrating upwards in the night. I've never thought about these things, that they are so affected by light.
Well, I guess in some ways, and this is just a thought that's come to my mind, animals on land may have seen fire, whereas marine animals wouldn't have seen that. So the only artificial light at night would have been the moon, I guess. The source of light at night would have been the moon. So yes, they're probably very much more impacted by it. And I know that one of my guests that I've spoken with before, Dr. Emily Fobert, she had studied the clownfish and noticed that as soon as you put lights over the top of them, they may spore their eggs, but they don't hatch.
I read about her research.
I think
I think I even contacted her at one point when I was writing. Yeah.
Well, she's a great source of knowledge on this, and I think her story was similarly of interest. It really, because it was Nemo, the clownfish. Everybody clicked on that story. So yeah. So it says in your Penguin blurb that this is the first book about science and the natural history of darkness. Does that mean that there's a sequel ready to come?
I'm doing research on a follow-up, but I think I will be moving into the more natural lights of the moonlight, for example. But I haven't really landed, where to. I was supposed to do this for a long time ago, but it was so much with all the translations and everything, and so, well, I can take that.
Yeah. Well, you were popular. You created a run for your own back in a way, didn't you? Well, even aurora. Would animals and insects be impacted by aurorae?
I don't know. Actually, it's a good question.
I mean, whilst it is a source of light to our eyes, it's also it's that whole magnetic field thing too, isn't it? That maybe birds and insects would be more impacted by. So, yeah.
I mean, perhaps I guess there are animals seeing the aurora in a different way, also. I mean, if you're out looking for the aurora, which I've been doing quite a lot this winter because we have a lot of sun activity, but I'm a little bit too far south. But my camera can capture the light, whereas I can't. So I took a few photos of the aurora, but I didn't really see much of it myself.
And that sort of comes back to the point that you made about, wouldn't it be wonderful if our night vision was better? Pick up colours and things at night.
Oh, yeah. There are so many things. I guess we would see things that we perhaps don't want to see. It's like if we have a better hearing, if we were hearing bats all the time. I mean, their echolocation can be 130 decibels. We would like to hear that.
Right. Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
They're very loud. It's very short range, though, but...
That's amazing. Is there a cultural connection to the night that you see is particular to Sweden? Is there First Nation stories or anything? besides those around the aurora?
Yeah, I mean, if you go up the north to Lapland, to Sapmi and the Sami country, I think they have a lot of stories about aurora, for example. And if you go back, I mean, the old stories of the Viking era or whatever, I mean, there are a lot of connection with this stars, but it's like everywhere. I mean, it's a huge part of the folklore. But I mean, as Scandinavia is quite far north, and we have all these long winters, perhaps the night is a bit. We love it and hate it.
That's interesting. And why do you love it?
It's relaxing somehow. It takes off the pressure of the need to do things. You can't do that much. I mean, historically, anyway. So I think we could, just sit down and, well, this is it. We can relax. Nobody cares. I mean, I think that's one thing, and you take away a lot of impressions, which is also could be a thing. It's easy to relax.
I've often thought that there's because I've seen people stand together, complete strangers in the dark, and because they can't see each other so much, I don't know, the conversation's different. They seem to, and they'll relax more. They'll not worry about what they look like. They'll just listen to the environment. They'll listen to one another better because they're not distracted by.
It's like these darkness restaurants. I went to a darkness restaurant in Stockholm, and it was pitch dark. I mean, you couldn't see a thing. You had no idea what you were eating. And the owner was playing the guitar, and it was.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
And they also have a podcast, so they interview their guests in darkness.
Mm-hmm. I love it.
Yeah, that was fascinating. It's
and were people more relaxed? Were people more aware of what they were eating? And
yeah, well, not at first. I think it takes a while before you get used to that, but after a while, yeah.
So you mentioned you love the dark, but you also mentioned there's a hate relationship there. So what's the hate around it?
I think it has to do with the long winters, that it's dark, and I mean, in the north it's really dark, but at the same time you have a lot of snow and perhaps the aurora sometimes, and in the south it's more like it's a very long autumn. At least at the west coast, and so you miss the sun, as what we were talking about when we started. You just stands like frozen for a few seconds looking at the sky when you see the sun in the spring. So we grow a little bit tired of the darkness. But at the same time, who doesn't love to sit by a bonfire looking at the stars and not having electrical lights shining on you all the time? And if you go to a restaurant, I mean, if you want to have a fancy dinner, you wouldn't like to have a bright place. You want to have a cozy place with candlelights.
Actually, I think that's one thing that Scandinavia does very well. The ambient lighting for restaurants and environments where you socialise are generally very warm. There's none of the harsh white lights that have crept into Sydney, that's for sure, and certainly certain places around Australia. I think that's part of the Asian connection, because there is a cultural connection to blue light, in blue and green lights, and bright white lights in Asia, and we have that cultural connection's coming through here. So, but it is lovely to sit in a restaurant and just have a candlelit table and warm, comfy lights above you. Yeah.
And
So,
light designers today are working a lot with that, and also to bring that out from restaurants and indoor lighting to use it outdoors as well.
I would say Scandinavia is one of the leading areas. Sweden, there's a lot of Swedish designers working in Melbourne, Victoria, in Australia doing, so it's good to see. So what do you aspire, what do you hope happens in Sweden with light pollution and darkness, and what's your little legacy that you'd like to leave the world besides the book?
I would like to see a dark sky sanctuary or a park or something like that here. But I also like to see that some sort of legislation, some laws or anything that tells you that if you want to put up a billboard or a new lighting systems, you need to do the proper surveys. You need to, what you would do if you're building a road or a house, you need to do all these different surveys. So that acknowledge light pollution as a true pollution.
Yes. Well, I know, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could actually have light listed as a pollutant around the world? And I think countries like England are getting close. They're having inquiries as to the impacts of light and noise pollution on the natural environment.
France is getting there, Germany is getting there, but it's a little bit slow, but it started to move a bit, and we won't stop turning all the lights on. I think the light pollution will continue to grow, but I think also that we have reached a point where perhaps all these LEDs are not as great anymore. We've seen it, we've done it, and now we can do something else.
Yes, I think you're right. And my husband, who's an astronomer and has done some work with the COPUOS, the Committee of Peaceful Use of Outer Space, and the mega constellations, wrote a paper about 5 years ago saying he thought that we would come to a period where our love for LEDs and our awareness of them would actually neutralise, and we would actually start coming into an era where we would be actually naturally reducing light pollution, because we would be A, aware, and B, the technologies would grow and expand.
It's like with a lot of new technology, you use it a bit too much in the beginning, and then you realise, wasn't that good? And then turns back a bit.
That's true. Yeah, it's true. So just to wrap up, I always ask my guests what their favourite dark sky experience has been. Have you got one? Have you got a moment that just stands out above all others?
I think. Well, it's hard because my darkness experience are often, the everyday experience. I try to get a little bit of darkness, walking the dog in the night, or when I'm working with bats. But I have this episode in the book where I took my family out in a rowboat to watch the shooting stars. In August, when the summer nights are getting dark, we just pack the small boat with a lot of pillows and duvets, and so it was really comfortable.
Sounds so wonderful, yeah.
Yeah, so we just row out a bit on the lake, and we just took up the oars, and we just lay down and looked at the shooting stars.
Oh, wow.
So that was,
And you said the family, is that, have you got children or?
Yeah, it was a few years ago, so I don't think we will all fit in the boat now.
But what a fabulous memory for your children to have.
Yeah,
and I'm sure that's engaged them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's probably one of the most outstanding stories I've heard, actually, that I'm quite jealous. That's lovely.
Yeah, it wasn't the best of night skies. It wasn't, a number one on the Bortle scale or something like that, but it's still a great night sky and a lot of shooting stars, and with the family, and you had the boat just floating around. The water was still. I mean, you could see the stars in the water, so it was like flying almost.
And it's one of those memories that I can feel because it impacts so many of your senses. You know, you've seen it, you've felt it, you've heard it on the water, and you've connected with people at the same time, and that's what actually creates the strongest memories, is when more number of senses are involved, the stronger the memory. Wonderful. Well, all I can say, and I'm going to finish it there because I think that's just a beautiful memory, unless you've got anything else you'd like to add, Johan, thank you so much for writing this magical book. I'm going to be sharing it with everybody, asking them to read it, and actually even the Audible. The guy who reads the English version of the Audible book has just got a lovely voice and beautiful storytelling. So thank you. It's a beautiful work. It's definitely going to leave a legacy, and I hope that Sweden can have a dark sky reserve sometime very soon. Thank you.
Well, thank you.